Hi everyone, so this is the last shortish video on research design, quantitative research design, and this is really just to give you a bit of an introduction to what surveys are all about. So surveys are really quantitative. There are theoretical arguments that it's possible to do a qualitative survey, but I don't want to get into that right now. Generally speaking, they are quantitative because the aim of the researcher in virtually all surveys is to objectively describe something about a group of participants, and so that quality of being objective and often having data in the form of numbers, which is typically what you'll get out of a survey questionnaire, makes this quantitative. So generally speaking, it is in virtually all cases. And surveys are useful for describing things about people's opinions and views. So a survey questionnaire, typically, I'm sure you've had the experience of responding to one at some point. And a survey questionnaire is just a set of questions which asks you about a certain thing. It might be about your knowledge of something, it might be about your attitude towards something, about your perceptions of something, etc., etc. But that's basically the idea behind a survey, is to find out about some of those things in a defined group of people. So you would use typically a sample, which is a subset of a population, a smaller group derived from a population that you're interested in. So for example, your population might be patients with a particular disorder. Your population might also be professionals. It might be ECPs, it might be doctors, it might be nurses, it might be students in a particular year of study or registered for a particular qualification. So there's a whole range of different things that you might be interested in. Populations generally are big. They're very, very big, and it's typically practically impossible to access an entire population and give them all questionnaires in a survey. It's quite rare that is the case. One exception might be if you wanted to do a survey of students in the Department of Emergency Medical Care. That might not be impossible to access the whole population, because who would that be? It would be first, second, third and fourth year students. Could you access all of them? You probably could, because you could distribute the questionnaires, for example, after a lecture. You might miss the odd person who's not there because they're sick or whatever, but that's an example of a small population where it might be feasible to actually access the whole population. But generally speaking, in surveys, populations are big, and so we can't access the whole population, and we work with a sample. So how do we get that sample? Well, it should be ideally probabilistically selected, meaning randomly selected. So we should be able to identify the entire population, and from that population randomly pick a subset, which, let's say you're dealing with a population of 10,000 people plus minus, you would then maybe pick whatever, 200 as an example from that randomly. And obviously random selection here is important, and it has the same importance that it has when I was talking about random allocation in an RCT. So random selection means that you avoid bias, and you avoid selecting a group of participants that is different to the population. So that random selection is actually really important. At undergraduate level though, it's often not easy to do this. So to be able to say that you've got a truly random sample is quite complicated. It's not an easy thing to do, and so usually at undergrad level we still do surveys, but the approach usually is to use convenience sampling, which is not as rigorous. Convenience sampling, you basically just draw a sample based on convenience. So whichever members of the population are easily accessible, you give the questionnaire to them, they give it back to you, analyze the data. So it has limitations, because that might end up being a biased sample, might end up somehow being different to the population because you have selected them in a non-random way. But for the narrow scope of these projects, it's usually sufficient. So surveys can either be cross-sectional or longitudinal. Cross-sectional meaning you hand out the survey questionnaires to whoever you've identified in the sample. They fill it in, they hand it back to you. It gives you a snapshot in a moment of time of what their responses are. So it's literally, it's like taking a photograph of something as it exists in a moment of time. That's cross-sectional. Longitudinal would be to do a survey repeatedly over a period of time. So in other words, you might give somebody a questionnaire now and then again in 6 months and 6 months later again, and you build up a picture of perhaps how their views or perceptions or whatever you're interested in has changed over a period of time. That is longitudinal. By far the most common way of doing surveys is cross-sectionally. So most surveys are just interested in people answering questions and giving you information about how they have responded to those questions in a moment of time. So it's cross-sectional. How can you collect the data? Well, you can do it directly. In other words, you can have people in front of you. An example might be if you're doing a survey with students in your class, you could hand out the questionnaires on paper to them, they fill them in, they give them back to you. So that's an example of direct data collection. They're actually sitting in front of you. You can do it by voice, and you can transcribe it. So the example, there's a telephonic survey. You might have even had somebody phone you up doing market research, for example, where they ask you a bunch of questions on the phone. It's quite convenient that you don't have to have the people in front of you. And the problem is, though, that you can't give them a questionnaire to fill in. So in this particular case, you read them the questions, they respond, they write down the answers. So that would be by voice. And then by participant entry, could either be by paper, so it could be direct, or it could be online. So online surveys are really the way everything is going with regard to survey research, because they're so convenient to use, and it's easy and convenient for people these days to access them. You can access a survey site on your smartphones, and just about everybody's got a phone. So it's not difficult to do. It's also very easy to set up an online survey from the researcher side, and usually the cost is low. If you take something like Google Forms, for example, it's free. So there's absolutely no cost other than the cost of just getting onto the internet. There are quite a few other commercial sites, SurveyMonkey and a whole range of others, but you have to pay for those. So there is some cost there. Things like Google Forms, as I said earlier on, is free. So less and less you will find paper surveys being done. Most people are going the route of online now because it's low cost and it's easy and it's convenient for participants as well. So what about the questions in your actual survey? Where do they come from? They can basically come from two different places. You can set up the questions yourself. That's called a custom developed questionnaire. Or you can use a pre-existing questionnaire that's been set up by somebody else. It's been used by other people and you're just using it in a different group of people. Which one of those is better? Well, it depends. You might be asking a research question and wanting to do a survey for which there's no pre-existing questionnaire. So you might be interested in a thing that nobody's done research on before, and as a result there isn't any pre-existing questionnaire. Then you don't have a choice. You have to come up with questions for your questionnaire yourself. So that's quite straightforward. Alternatively, you might be doing research on something where there is an existing questionnaire, and it's always a good idea, if there is a pre-existing questionnaire, to use it, because typically many of the pre-existing questionnaires have gone through a process called validation, where the quality of the questions and the validity of the questions has already been established. So that's great. You can use that questionnaire and you know it's a good questionnaire. The questions are clear, they make sense, and it's valid. An example might be if you want to assess something like burnout, for example, in a group of people. there are pre-existing validated questionnaires that do that already. So in a situation like that, you would not want to make up your own questionnaire on burnout, because it's quite a complicated thing. You would then go find a pre-existing questionnaire and use that. It's always a much better idea if you can do that. If you do use a custom developed questionnaire, it is difficult. It's difficult. You might not think so if you look at many questionnaires, but it's actually difficult to come up with really good questions that are clear. So that's the first thing, it's difficult. If you do it, you need to do a pilot study, which is giving the questionnaire to a small group of people before you actually use it for the survey, to assess the validity and reliability of the questionnaire. In other words, you need to run it through a kind of a quality check before you actually use it for your research. And there are ways of doing that. I'm not going to get into the details of that now, but it's important, because what you don't want is to quickly put together a questionnaire with a whole lot of problematic questions which you are not aware of, and then go and give it to all your participants and only find out when they respond that there are a whole lot of issues. Then you've basically wasted your time. So a pilot study is important if you've developed a questionnaire yourself. Just a list now at the end, this is the last slide, about some problems. So surveys are quite a popular choice for undergrad research projects, and that's not a bad thing. There are some limitations with them though. So the first one, especially if you've used a convenience sample, is that you can't really generalize those results to anybody but the people who've answered your questionnaire. If you use a random sample, then you actually can, because you've sampled in a very different way. But if you use a convenience sample, it's often, or it may not be representative of the population. So the generalizability of it is very limited, or it might be impossible to generalize those results. And at an undergrad level, that's not usually a big issue. But if you're doing a survey, maybe you're doing a master's or a PhD that involves a survey, you would want to be able to say that the data you've got doesn't just represent what those participants said. You would want to be able to generalize it back to a bigger population. But with convenience samples, that's a problem. Response bias is another significant problem with surveys, in the sense that if you send a survey out to 100 people, you won't get 100 people sending you the answers back. Typically the response rate with surveys is low, and that's the third point there on the slide. If you're doing a survey with online surveys, perhaps a little bit better, but it's widely regarded that with any survey, if you get a response rate of 20%, that's actually quite good, meaning that 20% of the people you sent the questionnaires to have responded. Now if you think about it, 20% is actually very low as a number, and that is because many people just ignore surveys. You hand them out, you give them to them on paper, or you send them an email with a link to an online survey. People are busy, they don't really care, and a lot of the time they just ignore it. So to get 20% is actually quite good. But there's a problem with that, in that you then only have 20% of the data from that sample, and so the question that often gets asked is, well, what would the other 80% have said? We don't know. And so that is called response bias, and it's obviously a problem if you've only got like 20 or 30% of the sample responding. The other problem with response bias is you might have people responding who are atypical compared to your whole sample. So if you're asking a question or a set of questions in a questionnaire about a particular thing, you might find some people in the sample are very interested in that thing or very good at that thing, and so they like your questionnaire and they respond. The people who don't know a lot about that thing or are not good at that thing might just say, I'm just not going to do this, and they don't respond. But that's a problem, because you're not getting a balanced view. You're getting a biased view from the people who know a lot about that thing, and that can lead you to quite false conclusions about what the whole population thinks. So it's actually really difficult to do a survey that isn't biased, because response bias, often there's no way of really getting around that. The unknown effect of non-response is what I referred to above, is if only 20% of your sample respond, what did the other 80%, what would they have said? We never know. And so that can be quite a big problem. The majority of people in your sample, you never get their data, and so you can end up with quite biased results as a result of that. And then the problem with custom developed questionnaires where you've come up with the questions yourself. If you don't do a pilot study, which you shouldn't do, you should always do a pilot study. But even if you do it, there might still be questions about the validity and reliability of the questions. In other words, when you've got a bunch of questions that you think are assessing a certain thing, is it really assessing that thing? Or are your questions just all over the place and unrelated to the thing? And you might think that's a weird thing, but it's actually really difficult to come up with a good set of questions that is valid, that actually gives you quality information on the thing that you're looking for. So that can be a bit of an issue. So that is the end of surveys, and that is also the conclusion of this series of videos on quantitative research design. So just to recap, under the heading of quantitative, we had observational research design, so that included case series, case control, cohort. We had experimental, and that was to do with controlled trials, or randomized controlled trials, and then a few other things at the end. And then we have now had surveys. So those things together all fall under quantitative research designs. The only outstanding part of this learning unit now is just a few things on qualitative research designs, which you'll find a little bit lower down. And maybe just to end off with, you might be wondering if these are the only research designs. They're certainly not. There are others. These are the most common ones. And typically when you do your research project, you will choose a research design to use. It is generally not the case, even at postgraduate level, that people make up their own research designs. Effectively, when you do research, there are a lot of existing research designs out there, and you pick one. You might modify it slightly, but it's generally a case of going and looking at all the different research designs that are available and seeing what is most appropriate to your research question.